We've all heard the phrase elephant in the room, and to be honest, some of us still cohabitate with them. What's your story? Let's talk about it.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Elephant Stories. I'm grateful for you all to be here, and I'm excited to actually have one of my most favorite humans that I've ever actually met, and I'm just truly beyond grateful for this human. I actually, I'll go into the story of how I met Tabatha a little bit later on, but I want to introduce you all to one of my friends, former coworkers, and just an amazing human all around, Tabatha Mason. So I'll introduce her and welcome her to Elephant Stories podcast. Welcome on, my friend. I'm so grateful to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure and privilege to be here. And I just always love time with you, but this is uniquely special.
Yes, this really is. And to be honest, you all, this is my first, this is the first episode that I've recorded video and audio, and Tabatha is actually my first guest. So this is kind of like our first, almost like tester episode. So if this gets posted, great. If it doesn't, you'll find out too.
That's right.
Either way, because we tested it out, we get in the field trying to see how this works. But I tapped Tabatha, and I reached out to Tabatha on the subject of fear, because this focus of this podcast and the focus of this season, not the podcast, but for this season, and the theme of the season is going to be centered around emotions. The reason that this podcast exists, and one of the reasons, Tabatha, that I wanted to have this podcast was to be able to talk about the elephant in the room and talk about the hard things and talk about the things that are kind of taboo or things that we're not super comfortable always being able to discuss and bring up. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I think I've had to become a lot more comfortable with and much more familiar with has been emotions in this past season. As you already know, I got laid off and lost my job a few months ago. And that experience, it took me out of the busy, moving along, doing a million things, just pushing along in life. And it put me in a place where I had to confront and deal with a lot of my emotions and confront a lot of things that I think I was able to avoid and not really, I don't know. It's like, they're happening, but again, it's kind of it's not like when you have your iPhone app and you need to close out the apps. It's like the apps that are running in the background.
Right.
But you don't realize it. You don't realize it until you go through and you start closing out. It's like, oh my gosh, why is my phone running slow? But until you realize that, you don't realize that. And I realized that there were so many of these emotions that were sitting right underneath the surface for me. Mm-hmm. And they were sitting, again, just right here in this seat, right, very present, but again, right underneath. And I was conditioned, especially as a Black male growing up in America and in the Midwest particularly, there were certain emotions you weren't comfortable with, and there are certain emotions that I was not able to always show or express as a Black individual, for a lot of reasons. But we won't dive into that for this episode. But specifically, I thought about you because me and you met each other at a point in my life when there was a place of transition. I met you when I ended up moving up to the Bay Area, and we can dive into that a little bit more too. But I met you in a place of life, and I also met you in a place of your life where we were being ushered into new seasons, whether we wanted to or not.
That's right.
We didn't really have a choice. We kind of got pushed into some transitions that were induced by circumstances of life. And I saw you navigate this season and this transition, and I've been watching you navigate it for a few years now, quite a while at this point. And I'm actually really curious, and I wanted to kind of, just hear more your story and dive more into how you've navigated fear through that transition. And I'll let you dive into some of the more specifics on some of the transitions that happened in your life and when we met during that time that were kind of going on. Because I believe I met you at the tail end of one transition, and then the other one happened. So we'll dive more into it, but you have been somebody who I've always trusted, and I've always valued your opinion and just your knowledge and your wisdom and insight. I mean, I constantly see the things you post online, on social media, and just, again, so I wanted to have you on, especially as one of my first guests, beyond you just being one of my closest friends, but you just have so much to offer, and I feel like your story can particularly help so many individuals. So I'm curious to kind of dive into a subject of fear and how it's how you've navigated and how you had to confront it even through that season. So why don't we start off first with, again, just where we met each other in that season. So.
Yes. That's so interesting. When you told me that the topic would be fear, I thought, I have so many layers of, we can talk about this from so many different aspects. And I love the analogy of applications running in the background, because as I begin to consider fear in my life and my relationship with this emotion, both like healthy fear of like, avoid this, don't do this,
Yeah.
and also terror, um, I began to think that, it's one of the first things I remember about my life from being so very young, being raised in a very rigid fundamentalist Pentecostal church. One
Yep.
of my earliest memories in life is the fear of hell, and it dominated my whole life. And to the point where, like you said, it was like running in the background all the
Yep.
time, and so took over and would like seep in to everything else and affect the way I operated, both in relationship to myself and relationship with others. That it and my relationship with God, like my understanding of God, my understanding of life, my understanding of myself was all formed through this lens of fear.
Wow.
And when we met, specifically, I was walking through a divorce, and not something I ever planned. But I then had to begin to face this fear of being alone. I didn't even know that I was afraid of being alone um, until the person I was married to for 17 years said, "I don't want to be married anymore." It just wasn't an option in my brain. And then I realized, like, wait, what?
And
I
it
don't.
was blindsiding. Like
Oh,
whenever.
totally.
Wow.
Absolutely. So blindsiding that I think for the first 3 or 4 months, I woke up every morning and had to remember what was happening in my life. Like, I would
Wow.
wake up in bed and be like, I don't understand what's going on. And then I would remember, oh, this is what's happening. And then
Yeah.
I would, and I was a single mom. I had 2 daughters. Um, and, and I was, working as a pastor in
Yeah.
Silicon Valley, which all that means there was definite financial insecurity as well.
Yep.
And so I was terrified, and very, in very real ways, like for like life circumstances, but then also like down to even in my body. Like for the first couple of years, I would wake up every morning between 4:30 and 5:30 and experience a panic attack and kind of just wait in bed until it was over. Then I would drag my ass out of bed and try and, I would take the dog for a walk. And I think I didn't know what I was doing at the time, but just even walking helped to regulate me. I would always say, oh, my walk makes me feel better. It's a very real scientific thing. I had no idea what I was doing, but I needed that kind of regulation in my system. And so I found things kind of by accident, actually, that helped me deal with that fear before I even was able to name it.
Wow. And I love that, because that's something that I've also had to I've also been navigating on my own end, even as I've been navigating being laid off and trying to process just through the emotions of that. Once I got laid off, I always walked and did walks and usually did about a mile a day. But since being laid off and now I have this ample amount of time, now I'm like doing multiple walks. And randomly at first it's like, man, these walks really do help me. I don't know what the heck the science is, but like, what the hell is going on? These walks are really doing something.
Yeah.
But so I absolutely resonate with that aspect with you, even concerning that, and just again starting off with these small little things that you don't even feel like are even related. And I really resonate deeply with the aspect that you mentioned around the aspect of fear becoming this base or this root at a very young age. Because I also, as you already know, grew up in a fundamental Pentecostal experience. And in that experience, again, fear is one of the main drivers. It's almost like the fuel, basically, that drives it. And kind of like what you were talking about, you were like, I didn't realize that it was basically bleeding over in so many other areas of your life and driving things almost subconsciously. And for me, I didn't realize that as well. Like, again, that fear of hell becomes like the first dominant thing of, I don't want to mess up because I don't want to go here. And if I do this, and if I mess up, that makes me a bad person. So it starts creating this very specific series and line of messaging that puts you in a very specific tracked.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I'm really curious, like, how did you end up being able to kind of unpack that, especially with you? Because obviously when I met you, when you met each other, we met each other in ministry. We both were already working in ministry. I came on as an intern. You were the worship pastor.
Right.
And even with that base, and again, by the time I met you, I think you were already, the divorce had already, I don't know, because we met in 2015, I believe, right? Or 26. Yeah, 2015, actually. So was the divorce finalized by that point?
Yeah, December of 2014. So we had been separated for 2 years, and the divorce was final about 6 months before I met you.
And the other interesting aspect was whenever I came on to this specific organization that we both were working at, and I ended up coming there because I was with a music group that was touring. And we actually ended up landing at this church, the very last stop of our tour, actually. And then the director comes out at the end and he's like, "Hey, we're looking for any interns. Would anybody be interested?" And again, this was the very last church on our tour. We had done like literally 25 churches, went all over the Pacific Northwest and Northern California. And I was like, interesting. So I decided to take the opportunity, and I ended up becoming a music intern, and I ended up working under Tabatha during that summer, and kind of like learning on and bringing other apprenticeship. Obviously, I'd already been doing ministry before, but whenever I met you during that time, it was also an interesting period because, from my understanding, your role was being transitioned to a different position. And I'm going to let you dive into that because you already know I got my feelings, but I'm curious, like, go ahead and dive into that because, yeah.
So I'd been the worship pastor of this fairly large church in our city. And let's just say that most evangelical spaces, especially white evangelical spaces, are not comfortable, even if they'll say, there are reasons for divorce.
Yep.
It's like a really sticky, tough subject. Everybody wants happiness. That's what everybody wants. And so discomfort is just, people don't know what to do with it. So it was a very uncomfortable situation. I mean, there are so many times I had to navigate that as best I could. And there were so many times where I wanted to scream and be like, oh, you're uncomfortable. Like, what on earth?
Right.
My life is falling apart. But I was told that I needed to smile while I was on campus so that people didn't feel uncomfortable around me, that I needed to learn to, have a certain presence and create a certain feeling, of course, while on the platform. All of this began to make me really, this is what I think the start of my journey away from the church as an institution. But yeah, I had been the worship pastor, and through that process, the male dominated staff decided that I actually should be underneath somebody else, and they put someone over me that I would both over me in the department, as well as kind of a buffer between me and the senior pastor so that he did not have to deal with me.
See, and that was one of the most interesting pieces because whenever I came on as an intern because I think the organization was in the process of possibly starting either a second or third service, I believe, over, and they want to start another service, so they were looking to hire another worship leader for that particular service. And whenever I met you during that time, it was interesting because the individual who was both of our bosses had no experience as a musician, as a singer in any aspect. So it was like, it would be moments like, okay, yeah, let's sing 8 songs. The hell? Like, what are you talking about? Like, what are we talking about? This is a lot. Do you know how much work that takes? And we work with volunteers and they ain't getting paid? Sir, no, thank you. But so I'd met you during that time, and the crazy part, and that was already a first point of contention and kind of like what's going on. But I think another aspect that I was able to quickly recognize when I joined staff and working with you that summer again was one, meeting you right after they made that transition, which I thought was really ironic. How do you get penalized when you're the one getting divorced? But
Right.
anyway, we'll dive into that in a second. And then the second piece was they not only do you get penalized because someone's divorcing you and they're leaving you from this relationship, but also now you have us in this dichotomy, in a situation that again wasn't even practical at all. It didn't even make a lot of sense. And I guess I'm curious on, why do you end up getting penalized based on your experience, or like based on the divorce? Do they immediately? And I'm curious on this from your perspective, from a perspective of a woman, because again, that was another thing that I think my experience working with you, that was one of the first times I was actually able to see. I think I don't mean to say this to sound ignorant, but I think as a black man, I never really assumed that I had any level of privilege. I assumed that, okay, I'm at the bottom of the totem pole, at least within our caste system here in America. So I wasn't able to always recognize it, but I think working on staff there at that organization and with you was one of the first places I was able to see it, because I could say the same thing you said, literally, and in the same exact meeting while sitting next to you, and they would, oh yeah, okay, and I was a new intern. Now, yes,
Right.
I'm confident. I was saying, but I still knew my stuff, and even regardless of me being intern by this point, I went back to school at an older age, so I wasn't like a teenager. I was already well into my career by this point. But the point is, I saw how the difference immediately in the difference between me and you. And in my opinion, even when we were developing some of the sermons and developing some of the aspects, you were one of the main contributors. And you went to school for theology, and you understood this. So I'm curious about that from your angle and from your end, and why do you feel like that ended up being, I guess, part of the aspect, and how that also helped fuel and funnel the fear? Why stay in something
Right.
like this? Also understanding your background, but so I'm curious how fear kept you in this situation, but also eventually pushed you to move on and leave and transition.
Yeah, it's interesting. I understood that a lot of that was around that same discomfort, right? Just me being present in a meeting meant all of me was there. So
Yeah.
here is this person who embodies this difficult situation.
Yep.
And that brings a heaviness into the room. So there was a lot of we don't know what to do with that. However, we also don't know how to just let this person go. If we fire this person, then the church will know, and then it will look bad.
So the church was so uncomfortable with the discomfort of you going through a divorce and how it was actually impacting you, that you're not met with empathy. You're met with, how do we pacify this, and how do we kind of work around this, because it's creating discomfort amongst the staff first and foremost. And is it just because they don't know how to deal with it, or is it just because it's, again, because like I said, I came at the tail end of it. So yeah.
Yeah, I actually was told by one of the pastors, this is really difficult for me. And I I was I don't really know what to tell you.
How the hell is it difficult for you, and you going through divorce? Sir, if you don't get out of my face.
Yeah. So I think I did at the time look for other work, given the situation of where my kids were in school, how I needed childcare, given all of the financial, the fear of that insecurity financially kept me in that place. I was afraid to try anything else. I didn't have a college degree outside of ministry and church vocational work. So I didn't have a context for bridging my work outside of a church or ministry. And I didn't have any safety net. So it's not like I could be oh, I'll go try that. And if it doesn't work, I have to make this work. Yeah. So some of it was just fear paralyzed me in that place. And actually, you say what helped you move on? I actually didn't move on. The church asked me to resign eventually, and I was sort of forced to move on. Mm-hmm. I mean, even when I was demoted, I remember thinking, I was so angry, and yet I sensed God say to me, it shouldn't have happened this way. This is not okay. There was nothing about it where people are because I had people ask me, don't you think that in the end, the Spirit is leading. And I said, no, I don't think that, because this is not indicative of the character of the Spirit of God. Nothing.
Because people
about this
often
is.
want to include it or say it was a spirit or that was God and somehow use it as a way to justify it. But it's like, also, do you forget that we're 50% of the equation and we played our part, and humans are ridiculous sometimes.
Yeah. And so I just said, no, I don't think it was God. It doesn't mean that God can't do something beautiful in my own life, even though, not because of, but even though, right?
Yep.
And so I just kind of hung in there and did my best to raise my kids and, be a good person and do what I knew how to do, walk with people in a spiritual way and lead them and lead my own heart. I remember, it's interesting. I remember one time having a conversation with God. I remember when I first began to be aware of my own fear, which was just unique, because I used to just like walk through life always afraid, but I wouldn't be able to say, you know what, I'm afraid. I just I was reacting, right?
Yeah.
But I remember one time stopping and telling God, I'm afraid. I'm feeling fear. And I remember the question surfacing in my heart, like, what are you afraid of? And I had to stop and think, like, what am I afraid of? And I said, I think I'm afraid of doing something wrong. And, like that.
And did you explore where that root came from?
Yeah. Like that behavior thing came up, right? Like, so that of course was like, if you do something wrong and then it's sin, and then sin separates you from God. And then, like it goes all the way back to, it always goes back to that fear of hell.
Yep.
Right. And so, I remember saying that I'm afraid of doing something wrong. And in a very sweet way, the Spirit of God spoke to me and said, well, you're going to do something wrong. And I was like, that is not comforting. Thanks a lot for that.
Yep.
Right. But then the next thing came. It was, Tabatha, you're going to do something wrong. And when you do, I'm not leaving. And actually, when I heard that, that's when I realized, oh, that's what I'm really afraid of. Right. I'm not so afraid of making a mistake. I'm afraid that
being left and abandoned.
My mistake will lead to abandonment.
Yep.
And when God assured me that I was not ever going to be alone, that is not the case. I will never leave you. I will never forsake you. I'm not going to leave you alone. I'm not disappointed in you. When you make a mistake, I'm still going to be here and we'll figure it out together. And that completely changed my life. Completely.
I love that so much, because it sounds like the first step that you took was, which I think is hard for a lot of people to do, is practicing self-curiosity. You actually stopped and acknowledged a fear that you were having, and then you practice curiosity around that fear. So I think oftentimes a lot of us are like, oh, I don't really feel anything, or it doesn't matter to me, I don't care. But I think we all recognize, because we all have that little instinctual gut feeling in our stomach, and when we feel a certain feeling, oftentimes we just lack the language or the understanding or the empathy or the space to express what we're actually feeling. And it sounds like you were able to practice curiosity around the fear, and you were able to, first by acknowledging the fear, actually saying, hey, I see you, I get you, you're here, we're here together, what we doing? And I think that's been one of the hardest pieces that I've really struggled with. It's like, one, saying, fear, I see you, hey, you're welcome to be in this journey with me. Because again, growing up, fear is often, especially growing up in the way that we did, fear is something that it's weird. It's like on one end, it's a motivating force and something that drives so much of who you are, but also on the other end, it's something that you want to eradicate. You shouldn't feel, and it's bad to feel it. And you need to be having faith and trusting.
Well, don't you remember? Okay, so how many times did you hear this? The Bible talks about fear. It says, "Do not fear." In fact, 365 times.
Yeah.
The Bible has it, this is my favorite little statistic. 365
which is so ironic.
Times.
Love that.
One for every day. Like, there's a do not fear in the Bible for every day. And of course, my first thing that I always say to that is, well, what do you do on a leap year? So
with AKA this year, right?
Take your little formula, please, and flush it down the toilet. Thank you very much. Like, I am not here for that. And I just think it's dumb. And so when people, even sometimes when I would be afraid and somebody would quote some passage to me and they'd say, well, the Bible says don't fear, I would be like, it's too late. Like, I'm already afraid.
Because what it's essentially doing is it's stripping you of it's stripping you of the aspect of a huge aspect of your humanity
Mm-hmm.
and emotions. And every emotion actually serves a purpose, and every emotion is actually there for a reason, and it exists for a reason. And fear is one of a strong emotions. Like, obviously, when you're growing up and you're a toddler and you happen to put your hand on the stove, that fear serves a good purpose. Then
Right.
you know never to do that again. Now, if you're a human being, clearly we will do it again. Well, not that, but other things. So fear
Yeah.
does serve a purpose, but it becomes a point to when it becomes, again, this driving factor. And I think, again, a lot of with how we were raised and how we were taught, specifically around spirit, which it's tough for me because on one end I hold space for it because I can understand the sentiment is we just want to make sure people get it. We want to make sure people are making it to heaven. And like, I can understand the heart and the intention and the reason and what we want to do behind it. But I've also seen, and I think we both have seen this from working in ministry, how fear can be used as a tool, how it's being
Mm-hmm.
used as a manipulation tactic. We've also seen it in politics. We've seen it in our nation fabric, politically, and so many other aspects that we've been seeing, especially over these past like 5 to 6 years. So I think I've also seen the negative side of how fear was used. Like,
Yeah,
again,
well, the scripture, it's interesting because what I think a lot of times what the church does with the scripture is use it as a tool of punishment, right? Like
yeah,
you're doing something wrong and it diagnoses it and tells you how horrible you are and
yep,
why you're worthless. Or it's dismissive. Like you're
yep,
afraid, well, you shouldn't be afraid. So you're like, well, that doesn't help. That doesn't help me. And I think it was, remember there was a time where I was alone. I was afraid. I began to think of all the scriptures that are like, don't be afraid. And I
yeah,
remember praying and being like, what is that even for? And I said, I'm already afraid. And I heard the Spirit say to me, I know you are, but you don't need to be.
mm,
And it just changed every time I would read do not fear. It shifted from a command to you don't need to be afraid. Like, and I thought about as a parent when I tell my kids, I'm not saying don't be afraid because it's ridiculous of them to do that, right?
yeah,
I'm saying I'm right here. You don't need to be like we'll do this together.
yep,
It's that same thing. It's that revelation or understanding of God as I'm with you.
yeah.
We'll do this together.
It's
You
not
know?
saying we won't go through it. It's not saying that the situation you'll be able to circumvent it. It's not saying you'll be able to go around it, but it is saying I'm partnering with you
Yeah.
and you're not alone, because often the biggest, I think, debilitator of factor of fear is the notion that you're doing it alone or that you're by yourself and that there is no help and that there is no one to help you. One of the aspects that I think, especially with describing what you're talking about, with how we've been related, how our theology informs our understanding of fear and how we relate to fear,
Mm-hmm.
specifically in the type of theology that we were reared under. That fear, again, that type of fear strips you of a lot of humanity. And like you said, it's either dismissive or it takes on this element to where you almost have to essentially disconnect from yourself. Like
Mm-hmm.
your body, like it's almost like your body's just a vessel and you are here just to be perfect and exist in this perfect like way. And if you exist outside of that, hell. Like, it's just like this constant fear. And I know for you, at least when I met you during that summer, I know you would get up in the mornings and swim.
Mm-hmm.
And I know you started doing things like that. And again, it just even how you mentioned earlier in the episode where you said you had like kind of you would stop and check in with your body and started doing walks. Again, as I found out, as I've reconnected to my body on my own healing journey, and as I've had to navigate and address fear, even over these past 6 months, it has been a really interesting journey. And I didn't realize how important the body is to that journey and how important the body is to bring along when you're trying to actually heal. So how did you incorporate your body, and what even made you more conscious of Tabatha as a being versus Tabatha up here? Because I feel like for me and you, we're both individuals who sometimes can live right up here and may have to work to bring the elevator down to the
Yeah.
body.
Yep.
So how have you
Yep.
navigated that whole piece? Because I feel like you've done that pretty well from what I've seen externally, but I'm curious to hear from you.
Well, certainly was a journey that I didn't do by myself or on purpose.
Yeah.
I've been through a lot of therapy,
Yeah.
and I remember one time my therapist looked at me and said, Christians, I am a Christian. I would still say I'm a follower of Christ. And my
Yeah.
therapist said, Christians believe that the body is eternal. And he looked at me one day and said, you might you're going to have a body forever. It's going to be different than the one you have now, but you might want to start considering how to have a relationship with your body. And I was like, oh shit. Like, and then things started to surface for me. I remember one time, like one of the, classic verses is like, I am crucified with Christ, yet,
Yeah.
and yet, what is it? I don't even said this my whole life, but there's a part of that verse that says, it's not I that live, but Christ that lives in me. And the faith that I now have, I live through the faith of the Son of God. But it says the faith that I have in my body. And I was like, I never saw that little phrase before, right?
Yeah.
I'm like, my faith was always in my mind.
Yeah.
My faith was about being in the spirit. And it says the life that I now live in my body, I live by the faith of the Son of God. And I thought, I don't live my life in my body. I mean, physically I do, but my awareness of my life was not my body.
Same. Yeah.
And so I kind of by accident fell into some of these practices. I did start to swim because I needed to exercise. I was told, through therapy, like start to move your body. And so I tried running, and that was of the devil. And so
low-key facts.
So I started to swim, and that actually worked better I appreciated it. And so it was very meditative for me. And also it was difficult. It was definitely a journey. Like I would say 6 months after I started swimming, I had a friend of mine ask me, like, why don't you kick when you're in the water? And I was like, what? They're like, why don't you kick?
Were you just using your arms?
I guess I was, because I wasn't even aware.
Yeah.
And that's when I realized, I guess I'm not even kicking, but I thought I was in my head. Like that's how disconnected I was from my body. Like my legs might move a little, but I wasn't really kicking, but I thought I was. And so I had to then think about like moving my legs and moving my arms and like that kind of body movement. I had to sort of reconnect with my body and had to find ways to do that. Swimming is one of them for sure.
And that makes sense because I think, again, I do not have children. I'm not a mother. I heard none of those aspects, but I think I've watched my own mother, and I've watched so many women in my life literally have to navigate so many aspects and have to almost like go into autopilot mode, which a lot of us do as humans. Mm-hmm. I think we naturally transition, but I think I've seen women do that to another level. I no longer believe that we are meant to multitask, but I think one of the aspects of like that I think I've seen like again women and a lot of people have to do is again this aspect of multitasking, having to just deal with so many different aspects. But one of the pieces that I think the church has made quite difficult, and specifically with some of the aspects of that we were conditioned to think about, is how in the world do you trust something that you were conditioned not to trust at all? When I hear so much growing up, my body's bad, your mind, the heart is deceitful and wicked. And again, yes, scripture says all of these things. Yes, like, and y'all, just to let you know, this podcast is not a religious themed podcast, but for our experience and me and Tabatha's relationship, it was very much a part of our experience and a part of our dynamic. So that's why this episode is focusing more on that sphere when we were in that. But again, you're taught not to trust your body. You're taught not to trust yourself. You're taught the mind is wicked and deceitful, and don't trust the heart. Like all these things, like don't let your good be evilly spoken of. Like, and again, there's so many other aspects in scripture and other texts that are there that are equally as important. Like again, the scripture that you read and you never noticed the body aspect at the very end, because again, we've been conditioned and we hyper focus on very specific scriptures or stories because they funnel using specific narratives that they want funneled. So I guess I'm curious on like, that's been probably one of the biggest challenges for me is trying to connect to my body. I had no idea that most of my awareness, if not all of my awareness, probably 128% sat up here in my head. And it took my therapist saying like, I need you to feel your emotions. Sis, what do you mean? I feel them. I'm mad. I get irritated. I'm all those things. No, but I need you to actually feel them. And I realize that I'm somebody who intellectualizes my emotions. I can figure it out. I know exactly what I'm feeling, when I'm feeling it, where I'm feeling it, that whole aspect, and I can talk it out and think it out. But it took me a long time to realize that process, and even me being able to intellectualize my emotions so much, was because from growing up in childhood and emotional abandonment and other aspects that I are not having language to understand my emotions. So I just held it in and kept it close to the chest and thought I was feeling it, but I wasn't actually feeling anything. I realized I was so disconnected from my body, and I also realized that religion played a large part in reinforcing this message that my body was bad. You add in being Black in America, I'm even worse. You
Yeah.
add in so many of these other aspects that make me who I am. I felt like being neurodivergent, like my sexual identity, all these aspects like ended up making me feel like there was just, like you're really, really bad. But again, I think the same can be said for women as well when it comes to your body and how people expect it to show up. So
Sure. I think that
yeah, curious.
the idea that fear is tormenting, right? Like there is
Yes.
an element, and our bodies learn to respond to fear in different ways,
And
right? So
and it does not forget, the body keeps mark of
yes.
all of it.
So there are times where we're afraid. I mean, most of us have heard, at least at this point now, culturally, of like the fight or flight
Yeah.
and freeze responses in women and some men, but like women also have a pretty typical response called fawning or befriending. Like
People pleasing.
if I'm nice to you, then that will help me stay safe. So what I think is interesting about that disconnection that you're describing is it's a trauma response. It's like I'm terrified. And so my body goes into this automatic disconnection mode. Like for me, I was a freeze person. And so I learned but the thing about religion was I could be this really successful religious person because I could live in my head. And it was great. I never had to deal with the things I was feeling in my body. In fact, that was looked down upon and horrible. And so it was like, it was very,
craft this representative of yourself basically and
it
never
was great.
actually feel. Yes.
Yes. It was conducive. I was like this really ideal Christian because I was so disconnected as a human being
from self.
And at some point I had to realize that this God that I said that I worshiped was the maker of the universe and created my body. And yet I did not know how to be a creature. And so I had to learn, what does it mean to feel, to exist, to desire, to be human? How could I be a good Christian if I couldn't even figure out how to be a human being?
And so many people don't recognize that, Tabatha, and they don't understand that disconnection. My therapist kind of put me onto a term probably about a year ago around that type of behavior again, where growing up, you meet so many amazing people who are believers and love God and are amazing humans, and nobody's really bad people, but like there's just a disconnect from who they actually are. And my therapist had introduced me to a term called spiritual bypassing. Mm-hmm. And it describes exactly that, where so many people, again, use religion as a way to bypass it. And it makes sense for a lot of Gen Xers and older generations, because only within like the last 10 to 15 years has podcasts and these self-help and all these other type of information become much more prevalent. And only recently has the church started to kind of somewhat dive and delve into it. I don't know recently because I've not been involved in that world at all. But it just seems to be a place that's kind of really been neglected and abandoned. So it's really interesting just seeing the tide turn around these type of conversations and seeing it kind of morph back into this aspect. But it still seems to be something that the church still is super duper duper uncomfortable with.
Well, uncomfortable because I would say uncomfortable a lot of times because of its history. The church is afraid of its history in this regard, right? Part of the reason the church says that the body is bad is because they want to disconnect from the body. I mean, look at the church's history with enslaving people. If we can make the body useless, then we can enslave folks and still stay Christians. We can still be these like ideal people in this religion and yet treat people horribly. And at the end, it's like you divorce yourself from your own conscience if you can do that. You make a reason and a pathway to continue this bad behavior and yet still convince yourself that you're a good person.
And to me, the most wild part about that is when you can disconnect from yourself and you're disconnected from your body that much, how in the world can you actually be the neighbor that actually extends love and does all those things when you literally actually can't even do it to the neighbor that's nearest you? And that neighbor is you.
Yes.
And I think that's the aspect that a lot of people that we ended up missing, because exactly what you're describing, I think that's one of the most mind-boggling aspects of all of that to me. Is like, again, it's such a disconnect that I've realized on my own healing journey, and after 6 years of therapy myself, that until I've actually figured out how to actually love myself and say, you get to be a human being. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to never have emotions. You will blow up. You will mess up. You'll hurt people. People will hurt you. Like, until I was actually able to find some sort of acceptance and embrace those aspects of the journey, it was like this perpetual loop of chasing something that actually was never going to come. And I feel like, again, when you're in that state and you're spiritually bypassing and you're putting out the perfect representative and never actually connecting with yourself, I think the healing journey has really reminded me that, oh my God, I felt like I was a shell of a human being.
Yeah.
I felt like I was like there, but I was not there. And only within, like, at 33 years old, finally at the stage of my life, I'm like, oh, our brother's in the building. Hello, I'm here now. But like, it's so wild. So even as you talk about, even as you're swimming, like, oh, don't forget to use your legs, or why do you only use your arms? Like, again, it's almost like when you start healing, you actually get serious about the work. It's almost like small parts start waking up in your body and in your mind. And it's not just your physical body, but it's even mentally. You start waking up other areas because, again, we're conditioned to focus on fear, focus on this specific aspect, or whatever we've been told to focus on. So it's really interesting to me.
It's following things down all the way down, right?
Yes.
It's like something surfaces and you say, I'm going to take the time to follow this all the way back, because I think a lot of times the root of something will surprise us.
Yes.
And sometimes we're afraid of where it will lead us. And so we just like, don't, right?
That part.
We don't want to go there. And yet other times we get to the end of it and we're like, are you kidding me? That is the dumbest thing I have ever heard. I constantly think of this story. I don't even know if the story is real, but this idea of like these newlyweds where this woman was going to make a roast. And so her and her husband, she like cuts off the end of the meat and sticks it in the pan. He's like, why are you cutting off the ends of the meat? And she's like, because that's how you make a roast. And he's like, what? I don't understand. Why? That seems like perfectly good meat. She's like, well, this is what my mom always did. So she called her mom and said, Mom, why do we cut off the ends of the roast?
Right.
And she said, because that's what my mom always did. And so she called her mom and she said, Mom, why do we cut off the ends of the roast? And her mom said, so it will fit in the pan. So here you have 3 generations of people who are cutting off the ends of the roast because grandma's pan was too small. And it doesn't need to happen. And yet we continue behaviors. Sometimes we don't even know why we're doing it. But if we stop and go, I'm going to take this one all the way back to where it started and then learn why.
Yes.
And sometimes it's
go ahead. What were you going to say?
I was going to say, sometimes it is a scary thing. Sometimes some of our behaviors are from some pretty crazy shit, right? Yep. And then other times it's dumb stuff like that. Like it's because I saw someone do it and I just have always done it that way. There's no rhyme or reason. And so I start to realize, I have more agency than I'm allowing myself. Like I get to choose. There's no rules here. I get to choose how I live my life.
And that's the thing that I think unfortunately, I think religion sometimes in a way that they're trying to actually help you and they want to make sure you don't die and go to hell and the whole aspect, they end up robbing you of that autonomy and they end up robbing you of the ability to actually, and they don't rob you, we rob ourselves of that.
Yes.
Because I don't think we realize that. So no, I'm not, this is not about bashing the church or anything aspect like that, but this is an aspect of you end up being robbed of those aspects. You feel like you don't have the autonomy and you can't make those type of choices for yourself. So it creates, again, this major disconnect that you just, I don't know. It's just so interesting, Tabatha. Like, this is why I want to talk about this, because again, you find out how fear interweaves itself through all of those elements and how it undergirds this whole thing. And then again, one day you wake up and it's like, wait, what's happening? Mm-hmm. Because I think a lot of us, to your point, are afraid and we lack the curiosity to actually dive into ourselves because we're scared. And I get it. I'm like, like, for example, over this past 6 months, I found myself dealing with anger a lot. And I'm like, why am I so angry? Like, what's going on? And this is a bad emotion. It's not good because of what I've been conditioned and what I've been told. And also how it looks for a Black male, or how I've been told what it looks like. So I've just been in an emotion. I've kind of like, no, I'm not going to really deal with it. I'm not going to really feel it. So I've disconnected from that aspect. But I'm realizing like it's a part of my humanity, and we often are mad about things. We often are having valid feelings on certain things. And what does it mean to actually hold space and humanize ourselves and actually let ourselves exist without putting ourselves back into this template that many of these systems require? And it doesn't matter whether it's church, whether it's work, whether it's I found out any organization with humans.
Phrase that question for me.
We talked about, again, just how fear has influenced so many aspects of how we move and how we navigate.
Yeah.
And you've talked about the aspect of how you've found connection to your body through curiosity. Even though you talk about even the marriage after the 17 years, you kind of be blindsided, like, wait, what's happening? What? And even how you had to remind yourself over the next few months, like, oh, I'm getting a divorce. Like, my life of what I've known for 17 years is now being altered. And having to connect and relate to that fear, and having to connect, and also, and again, I can't imagine from an aspect of being a mother, also the fear of what happens to my daughters. How are we going to navigate life? Now they're going to have to deal with a whole different situation.
Right.
So I guess ultimately navigating all of that, dealing with the church experience, how that was responded to, and then fast forwarding to now.
Yeah.
What has been the transition and the update from, because that was back in like 2015, 2016. I know I ended up leaving, just to kind of cap off the story. I ended up leaving this organization, this church, at the end of that summer, because in my opinion, based on what I kind of saw, and Tabatha, too, like, it seemed like they was kind of almost bringing me in as not a replacement for you, but it felt like that.
Yeah.
And it took me a minute to kind of catch on to it. Again, I didn't really recognize it until we started singing in meetings, and I was seeing the difference of how they were communicating with you and certain things. And I started seeing again how our boss was gearing more things towards my end and just doing little weird covert things and not communicating. But what they didn't know was, me and you was road dogs. Don't play with me. And one thing I am is loyal. Don't play with me. I don't care what it's about. Don't play. So you already knew, again.
Yeah.
So by the end of the summer, I had ultimately made the decision I was going to resign, and that because I ended up getting hired on staff officially, transitioning. But so I'm curious on the update of your life from then, because once I left, obviously life happened. Me and you have stayed friends and stayed just as close as we were when I lived up in the Bay Area. But now, obviously life is way different for me and you both. And I'm curious to see kind of how you've navigated that fear, and what fear was the propeller. It was a driving force for you before in this very negative sense.
Yes.
How has it driven you to the place that you're at now? And how do you feel like fear has actually served you in a positive way now?
Sure. Thank you. When I left the church, I got a job for working for an education nonprofit. And it was sort of the first time I also was brought into the world of learning about the real deep history of America, and a lot what is now seen as like diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, those kinds of
and was this your first time working outside of church, outside of ministry as well, full time?
Yep.
Oh wow.
Yep.
And how old were you at this point?
I had done some like bookkeeping and small things, but like this was my first full-time gig out in the world. I was 45. So I had a very sheltered, a very sheltered existence.
Yeah.
And was just opened up into something brand new. And I was exposed to this quote by an Australian Aboriginal elder. Her name is Lilla Watson. And she says this: if you've come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. And that concept really began this driving force. I think we would have said it like this in the church that we were in. There was the statement we used to say that let us be healed as we participate in the healing of others, right?
I forgot about that.
So this idea that you don't get free by yourself. So my freedom from fear certainly had my own journey and my personal work. I, maintained work with a therapist. I maintained this like somatic journey of like being connected to my body, or at least this journey trying to be. But really it was standing in solidarity with historically excluded people in our country, and finding this journey of liberation through other people's stories that helped to open up my own and helped me to see freedom for myself in a different way. So I would say that like freedom for me really from fear especially really began to come as I began to work for the freedom of other people.
I love that so much. And it sounds like, again, as you healed and as you learned to settle into your body and embrace fear as just a human aspect,
Mm-hmm.
it allowed you to actually, from what I'm hearing, to me, it allowed you to connect to the deeper aspects of empathy.
Yeah.
And how you can relate to those on the margins and those who exist on the fringes, and how you connect to those. And that's work again, that's one of the first things that drew me to you as well. Again, because you don't see a lot of white women doing the type of work that you are willing to participate in. And obviously this is not like, oh, the white savior complex. We don't want to jump into that whole piece either, but you are somebody that I can honestly say as a Black person and as a person of color, I've seen actually legitimately be like legitimate to the work to the best of their ability, ask questions, practice it through curiosity.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess what I'm hearing, did you find a lot of healing by participating in helping other people who were afraid?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's where that was really key to my own aspect of, well, and being engaged with the humanity of other people let me accept and see my own humanity, right? And then I think on that level was where I was able to then engage with my own fear, because I not only had fear, I was afraid of my fear.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, right. Yep. A lot
like,
of us are.
if like, so here I'm operating out of fear, but I'm afraid of that because that fear is a sin. So now I'm afraid of being afraid. It was this spiraling effect. And it wasn't until I was able to engage with somebody else and be able to walk with them through their journey of fear that I was able to say, this makes sense. This is a human journey. And then I could have compassion on myself.
And it wasn't like a partnership in walking with them. It wasn't like I'm coming in to fix your fear. I'm coming in to partner alongside with you and walk with you alongside it because I get it and I know what it's like.
Sure. And hearing other people's stories, I mean, I remember those breakthrough moments of being like, of course you're afraid. Of course that makes sense. And then I would see myself and go, oh, well, I'm a person.
Yep.
Right. Even my journey of motherhood, like seeing my children and having some complete understanding for what they're walking through. And I have my therapist say, but you were a little girl once. What about little Tabatha, and being able to step outside my current existence to have empathy even for myself helped me to be able to take care of myself.
And that's exactly why, and I love that, Tabatha, and that's exactly why I created this space and why I wanted you to be one of the first guests on here, because it's those stories that we lack curiosity around, or those stories that we're afraid of, or the stories that we don't know exist within other individuals. And when we don't know those stories exist, we assume that it's just us and we keep it within ourselves. And I even just saw a newsline headline today, I think it was on NPR, where it's like loneliness is now it's like a huge epidemic in the US now. And I think what you did was, the aspect that I love that you did, and the aspect that I've been learning to do as well, is connecting with other people and connecting with their humanity, because it reminds you of your own. And you're reminded how we all actually are connected, how we're all not really that different, how all of us have different stories. And when we actually connect with each other's stories and we connect with each other's experiences, we find so much more aspects about ourselves. So that's why I created this podcast. And that's exactly what I want this podcast to be, is to tell stories and to engage people with themselves and to help them tell different stories about themselves and about their experiences and about who they are and who they are. Yeah. So I really just want to say thank you so much for being my first guest. I don't care that the episode wasn't perfect. I don't care about the glitches, none of those aspects. Like, we're going to edit, get out what we can, but I don't care if y'all hear noise in the background. Unfortunately, I live in Long Beach and near the airport, so you will hear planes flying probably until I can give me some money. So be sponsored somebody so I can get a better setup for my podcast. Let's sponsor, brother, because LA is not cheap. That's right. Tabatha, seriously, I am beyond grateful for you, and I'm beyond thankful for you. You have been such a light and such a presence since the day that I met you, and I figured Spirit brought us together for a reason. It took me a while to finally recognize that, but I'm so grateful because, again, there's so many aspects I learned about myself and learned about just the experience around gender, around religion, around just motherhood. So many aspects, again, as a male that I've never even thought about. So I just want to say thank you for being you, and thank you for your story. Thank you for coming on today and sharing and just existing as you are. And I think that's what I want this space to do, is encourage other people to exist as they are and connect and become comfortable with their own stories. So
Yeah, well, thank you
thank
for
you.
the time and the invitation, and really, truly, thank you for just the years of friendship. Many, I don't know what your relationship is like with other people, but us two meeting in church also meant that we should never sit together in church because
Facts, because you already know.
because we were a mess. But
don't let me see something funny, because you know I'm gonna say something.
But it's always a pleasure to get time with you and to have conversation. I always learn something about you, and I always learn something about myself, and I really appreciate it.
Listen, it is absolutely mutual, my friend. I so appreciate you, Tabatha. Thank you for joining me, and thank you all for listening in for this episode of Elephant Stories. I'm excited to tap into more stories. I'm excited to have Tabatha back on for a few more episodes, talk about other topics, and see where else she can input more wisdom. But thank you all for joining, and I'm excited to dive into the next episode. But this season is going to focus on emotions, and we're ready to talk about it. So you already know, until next time, don't let the truck hit you on the way out. All right. Bye, y'all.